CMAP Talks with the Cook County Forest Preserves. My name is Courtney Barnes, and I'm an engagement associate with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. We are so happy that you can join us this morning. First, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please enter your questions in the chat box. We will monitor them and try to address as many questions as we can. At the end of the webinar, a recording will be made available after the webinar. And please share your thoughts in a quick survey after the webinar. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this morning's discussion, Chloe Earn-Sands from the Metropolitan Planning Council. Chloe is Manager in Health Equity Planning and Planning at the Metropolitan Planning Council. She is a public health professional whose work across the organization focuses on bringing population health priorities into MPC's program areas. Before working in urban planning and policy, Chloe was a researcher and instructor for the intergroup dialogue programs at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Michigan. She brings this background in identity-based education to her role as co-chair of MPC's Internal Equity Committee. Chloe.
Thank you, Courtney. Good morning, all, and welcome to our webinar this morning. Thanks to the Cook County Forest Preserves and to CMAP for convening this really important discussion on identifying and addressing inequities in access to our parks and open spaces. We are welcoming three panelists this morning: Katie Piotrowska from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, Kathleen Yang Clayton from University of Illinois at Chicago, and Tracy Bishop from the Cook County Forest Preserves. Thank you, and looking forward to our presentations and our discussion with you all. For our audience, during the discussion, please put your questions into the question or chat boxes, and we will address those at the end of all the presentations, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So on to our first panelist, Katie Piotrowska, who will be talking about some background and data about regional access to parks and open space, identifying our region's economically disconnected and disinvested communities, and goals of the On2 2050 regional plan. Katie is an associate planner at CMAP, working in the local technical assistance program. Her work focuses on helping communities across the Chicago region develop plans that implement and advance the region's comprehensive plan. During her time at CMAP, Katie has worked on a variety of planning topics, ranging from parking management studies to economic development and transit-oriented development plans. Prior to joining CMAP, Katie worked as an analyst, helping municipalities across Illinois recover utility tax revenues. She received her master's in urban planning and policy with a concentration in environmental planning from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Glad to have you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Piotrowska, and I'm an associate planner at CMAP. And today I'll be discussing CMAP's regional goals for parks and open space access, as well as some of the disparities in access to parks that currently exist within our region. Next slide. So goals and recommendations for access to parks are part of our region's long-range comprehensive plan called On2 2050. The plan is guided by three principles: inclusive growth, prioritized investment, and resilience. The work I'll be discussing today is rooted in the inclusive growth principle, which aims to increase economic opportunity and improve quality of life for all residents of our region. To help advance that principle, CMAP identified two interrelated geographies called economically disconnected areas, or EDAs, and disinvested areas. So these areas of the region are currently not well connected to economic prosperity, and residents who live there experience many challenges in terms of quality of life, including inadequate access to parks. But before we discuss some of these disparities, I want to take a look at where these areas are located within our region and some of their characteristics. So the map on the next slide shows the geographic distribution of these areas within our region. So EDAs are depicted in yellow and have concentrations of low-income households and households that are either minority or have limited English proficiency. So depicted in blue, we have the disinvested areas, which are primarily non-residential areas that have experienced long-term employment loss, as well as low rates of small business openings and declining values. So our region, in every county, there's either a disinvested area, an EDA, or both. So there's also a lot of overlap between the two areas, and a lot of this overlap is concentrated in southern and western parts of Cook County. And these are the areas of focus for some of the Cook County Forest Preserve's racial equity work, which will be discussed later in the webinar. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, residents of EDAs and disinvested areas don't have the same access to parks as other areas of our region, which has implications for quality of life and public health. Studies have shown that having access to parks can increase one's ability to engage in physical activity, and parks can help build community by bringing neighbors together. Parks also have environmental benefits like reducing flooding and improving air quality within a community. So for all these reasons, Onto 2050 calls for increasing access to parks in our region, especially in currently underserved areas. So to understand current trends in our region, CMAP measures access to parks based on geographic proximity to open space, and we use that data to set measurable goals that can be tracked over time. In the next slide, we have the Onto 2050 Access to Parks indicator, which shows actual parks access data on the left-hand side and our 2050 target for access to parks on the right-hand side. So depicted in green, we have the percentage of the region's population that has access to at least 4 acres of park space per 1,000 residents. And depicted in purple, we have the percentage of the region's population with access to at least 10 acres of park space. So currently, about 42% of the region's population has access to at least 4 acres of park space, and 16% has access to at least 10 acres. And our vision for 2050 is for 65% of the region's population to have access to at least 4 acres of park space, and 40% to have access to at least 10 acres. And generally, the 4-acre target is more appropriate for built-out communities like the ones located in Cook County, while the 10-acre target is intended for less dense areas. So as you can see, we still have a long way to go to reach our 2050 targets. And in order to reach these goals, we will need to address some of the disparities that currently exist within our region, especially for communities of color and low-income communities. Next slide. So data plays an important role in figuring out where we should focus our efforts to increase access to parks. And when CMAP examined access to parks data specifically for residents of economically disconnected and disinvested areas, we found large disparities in access to parks between these residents and those in the rest of the region. As seen in the chart on the next slide, about a quarter of residents who live in EDAs and disinvested areas have access to at least 4 acres of park space, compared to more than half of the population in the rest of the region. And only 6% of residents who live in these areas have access to at least 10 acres of park space, compared to about 22% of the population in the rest of the region. Next slide. So to address some of these disparities, the Cook County Forest Preserve is using CMAP's EDA and disinvested areas data to ensure that more people in Cook County have access to open space, especially communities of color. So this not only makes access to parks more equitable, but also gets us closer to reaching those goals that I mentioned in the previous slide for access to parks in our region. And I think it's important to note that this will take a coordinated approach, and in order to ensure that everyone in the region has access to parks. So thank you to the Cook County Forest Preserves for using our data in a meaningful way and contributing to this effort. In the next slide, we have some resources that I discussed. So these two resources are GIS files that contain the data I discussed, and it's open to the public. Anyone who's interested in checking it out can download it from the CMAP Data Hub and investigate it on their own. I'd also like to mention that another great resource is the community data snapshots that CMAP updates on a yearly basis. And that data, that resource has a wealth of data, including data on access to parks for all of our counties in the region, our municipalities, as well as every Chicago community area. So I would encourage everyone who's interested in checking it out to take a look. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chloe.
Chloe, you're muted. If you would unmute, please.
There we go. I wasn't able to unmute myself for some reason. All right. And everyone, this is my son. He'll be popping in and out. But thank you so much, Katie. Welcoming our next two panelists, Dr. Kathleen Yang Clayton is a clinical professor in the Department of Public Administration, College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Kathleen directs undergraduate studies and civic partnerships for the department. Her experience in social justice and racial equity campaigns includes immigrant and voting rights issues, with a current focus on expanding the use of racial equity policy analysis across a range of sectors and issue areas. Kathleen earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago and also holds a Master's of Science in Natural Resource and Agriculture Economics from the University of Arizona. Tracy Bishop has worked for the Forest Preserves of Cook County since 2014. As a manager of permits and revenue, she helps oversee the customer service related policies and practices that produce a welcoming experience for millions of people that use and visit the forest preserves, and work to secure additional non-tax related revenue that goes into the initiatives that help protect, conserve, and restore the 70,000 acres of Forest Preserves lands. In addition, Tracy serves as the co-chair of the Forest Preserves Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. Thank you, ladies.
Unmute. All right. I guess I'm going to kick us off, and then I'm going to pass it on to my partner, Tracy Bishop. Okay, so next slide, please. We're gonna try to move forward in terms of what we're talking about here. So you guys have seen some of these screenshots of the position paper. I just grabbed some of the main recommendations, but I'm going to kind of talk over them. Just to remind everyone, the mission of the Forest Preserves is slightly different than parks. There's a conservation element to Forest Preserve work that makes it a bit more challenging because, you have to think about how you're preserving and protecting nature and also connecting people to the nature. But if the nature is kind of far away, right, because that's one of the challenges. You're trying to look for undeveloped land, or, in a lot of places that we're talking about that are EDAs is mostly urban, like it's already been populated and paved over and stuff like that. So the challenge really is, how do you meet that the twin missions of the forest preserves. So these recommendations were really built upon a lot of process and deliberation from both internal staff as well as folks like myself and other external partners. And we think that it's really a pretty accurate roadmap for us to be following. In fact, if you could just move forward, please. You know, the history of the short history, right? It's not like decades, but the short history of the Racial Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee is actually that it really was formed in 2017. So it predates the position papers, it predates the work that we've been doing. And they were kind of marching forward and sort of thinking about ways to apply these principles and this framework. But then the Caldwell Woods, there was an incident in Caldwell Woods in 2018 that the superintendent, Arnold Randall, really sort of describes as a wake-up call to him and his leadership and everyone in the forest preserves. You know, they thought that, okay, well, we had set up these committees and we had these plans, we were thinking about a position paper, and we were working on them, and here we go again. And they all collectively sort of, you know, came together and realized that more needed to be done. And so they were reaching out and doing some research and stuff like that. And, you know, I had a chance to partner with them. And, you know, really, it's important to just highlight that, you know, I sit firmly within the space of public administration and policy. There's a lot of work that gets done within the internal environment of organizations, agencies, nonprofits, government, that really plays a very fundamental role in how racial equity actually gets operationalized and implemented. And so we came together and we decided that, yes, you know, in fact, if we don't include the internal work, and what we talk about a lot is that including the community within the agency, like if we keep on ignoring that or we don't treat it seriously, then whatever plans you have to set up an external commission or to issue a statement or whatever really isn't hooking back into the DNA of the institution itself. So we really did use that position paper kind of as a North Star for the work that we were going to focus on. And so in the last bullet, these are the questions that have been guiding us. So how do we internally reflect the importance of our goal of making the forest preserves welcoming to all? And again, just to kind of, you know, double click on this, welcoming to all that includes potential staff or staff who are inside the organization first, so that when they go out into the community or they're engaging with the community, they see themselves as part of a continuum. Secondly, how do we institutionalize the READY team principles and work and integrate it so that it's not dependent on one person or initiative, but embedded deeply into the everyday operating procedures of the organization? Okay, so those are, okay, we don't have all the time in the world, but we could unpack those two things for quite a while, but that's really a distinction or a refinement of sort of this broader sort of dialogue and discourse that's happening around racial equity in general. This work is very much focused on the internal environment. All right, I think I have one more slide. If you could move forward, please. Thank you, Courtney. All right, so, you know, we kind of pulled back together and, you know, where do we start? Again, almost felt like, you know, okay, we had that incident, and so we were kind of reimagining and redeveloping, you know, what the strategic plan was moving forward. Okay, so operationalizing racial equity within organizations requires at least these 5 things, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. Okay, so it has to be data-driven, evidence-based approaches, and the example with CMAP's data and using the EDA is absolutely an example of data-driven. There's also data that we collect internally by doing interviews with staff in different departments, not to talk about systemic issues, institutional issues that we're trying to really test and see, all right, is this something that really is creating a common issue, not trying to level it at one individual or one position or one department, but really coming up with social science-based questions that we can actually answer with real data. The second thing that we started with is assessing the forest preserve operations, policies, and procedures so that we could build upon what's actually working well and to change what is not. And by change, we talk not only about dismantling or getting rid of barriers, we emphasize very strongly the idea of actually building structures of inclusion, building procedures and policies of inclusion, because often it's just not good enough to say, hey, we got rid of the moat, right? There's still a lot of people who maybe can't actually walk across like a deeper moat or don't want to do that, or you got to actually build a bridge with like maybe some flowers and welcome signs. Like it's just not good enough. If for decades, if people have felt like they have been excluded or marginalized, you also really have to think about that inclusion piece. So we have taken on an approach that is really about change management that's driven by racial equity analysis. So it's about culture change as well as process change, but we focus almost exclusively, not completely, we've learned lessons in 2020, but almost exclusively or first on institutional change, not individual change. So as important as it is for an example of individual change are trainings such as implicit bias trainings. That's great. We all can benefit from that, but the work of READY is primarily focused on dismantling institutional racism, essentially. So our methodology, our process is really training, practice, training. Like we go through these iterative cycles. The training is comprised not just of essential or basic racial equity principles, but we also blend into that training around project management. How to develop effective agendas, how to facilitate, and actually this year we also did a train the trainer with committee members so that they could actually be the trainers around what we're calling a READY 101 workshop that's going to be offered to the entire agency. And finally, the real important piece to all of this is to build an internal team of staff who care deeply about the work and are fully supported. And it's a team, but it's really almost like you're building a coalition of the people who are willing to volunteer their time, who are motivated to do this beyond just like one grudge or one issue. They see the promise of how much more effective this organization that they work for and the mission that they love can be if they come together and do this work with READY. I think that's my last slide, but if you can move forward. Yes, it is.
Yes. Thank you, Kathleen. And just to step back a little bit and talk about that Caldwell Woods incident that actually took place that really helped form the need for READY among the position papers, among other things, was that actually took place where a young lady was celebrating a birthday in one of our locations and was being harassed by a non-Forest Preserve employee. However, there was a Forest Preserve police officer on site that did not stop the harassment, that did not stop the guy from getting in her face, and that caused us to really look back and see the work that we need to do as well as far as internally, as well as making sure that we're able to exercise that and express the need internally and externally among our guests. So just to kind of give you a little sense of that, because I've seen something in the chat of someone wanting a little clarity. So as Kathleen mentioned, she gave a pretty much a really good overview of how we began, where we are, and where we plan to go. But just to really get you to really understand the impact and how we really want this committee to be sustainable. In year one, we were really focused on assessment and training and pilot projects. And we consisted of about 15 READY members that represented various departments across the district. And each committee member went through a series of about 6 months training. And again, we're still learning and we're still training. As she mentioned, we're doing facilitating training, but this was in-depth training. And on top of that training, we actually also developed 3 pilot projects. The 3 pilot projects consisted of HR, training, and community engagement. And we're going to get into the community engagement piece a little bit later. For this year, we really wanted to focus on, originally, we wanted to focus on the 3 projects and really focus on the implementation of them, as well as the train the trainer, as well as getting our second group, our second cohort group, which consists of about 10 members, getting them up to speed, taking them through the exact same training that we went through the previous year. Then, just like everybody, COVID hits, right? So now everything somewhat comes to a standstill. And on top of COVID, a couple of months later, now we're dealing with the George Floyd murder. So we had to actually readjust our plan for year 2 and just kind to really assess the need for the staff, on top of us needing to really push these projects out. So we also, as a result, we also worked on creating the racial identity caucuses, which was very essential for that time. And we received a lot of feedback from it, to the point where we also want to, in year 3, getting to facilitating trainings within the committee. So we want to make sure that this was not a one and done. We wanted to make sure that we're creating a process and a structure that's going to actually continue on for years to come. In addition to that, we're still working on pilot projects. So we're still working on new, as well as some of the pilot projects from the previous year. But what we wanted to really do, because COVID and working from home, and it's just been very difficult to work at the same capacity as we did previous year. So what we focused on for this year was just the HR project. In addition to the new cohort, they're training and they're also working on new projects, new pilots. So for year 3, what we want to do is, again, as we're working to be sustainable and have this continue for years to come, really work on strategic planning. And again, training, can't say it enough. And just, again, remaining sustainable. So with the next cohort, we anticipate bringing in an additional 15 to 20 members. And again, these are volunteers from across district departments. And they're going to work with us to do those trainings, introduce new pilot projects, as well as implement, create the implementation of the pilot project so that we're ready to go. And one of the things that we're going to work on this year, we're going to start an annual report so that we can really keep these guidelines, as well as this timeline that we have here, really be able to track and monitor the things that we were able to change, and as well as our plan for years to come, so that we're always one step ahead and making sure that we're good to go when it comes to transparency, as well as just detailed strategic plan. And on the next slide, what I wanted to do is just give you a little bit more detail about one of the actual groups, pilot project groups, which was our outreach and development team. The CMAP data was very, very essential for this group. Their goal was to connect with communities and make it more effectively and efficiently and equitable. So one of the things that we noticed within this group is that they started off actually just inquiring about a grant program that was being offered by one of our departments. Come to find out, this grant program, many people within the department rarely knew much about it. Many people within the district knew very little about it. So the initial goal was to, let's get this information out. Let's get these EDAs introduced to this grant money. Let's get them to the forest preserves. Let's make sure that they're getting this experience. But then we also realized that once we get them here, then what? Because what we also noticed is that the current process was extremely complicated. So we can get them there, but then if they don't have the resources and the assets to read legal jargon, to go through 200-page contracts, to make copies of packets that are 400 pages for RFPs, how do we make sure that we're not creating another boundary for them to be a partner to actually help us really engage with those communities? So they realized that they needed to actually simplify the existing partnership agreement and procurement process. So not only do we want them here, let's make it easier for everybody. In addition to that, there are also issues where people did things a little differently depending on their department. So one partner may go to one department and told to do one process, and then you get another process depending on the other. So the idea is to really develop and test those partnerships and really try to create things that were consistent. And we wanted to really track this model as much as possible. As Kathleen mentioned earlier, data is very essential. And again, we were not able to really even start this work without the information we received from CMAP. So the information that we received was very essential to at least get the initial group notified that we are here, that there's programs here for them to participate in, to receive grant money. And so on the next slide, what this committee group did was they actually took the information. So if you see on the map on the right-hand side of the screen, so there is a list of the dots represent groups that were already partners as well as new partners. So the idea is to really grow that within those EDAs, those economically disconnected areas. So what they did was they worked to expand event guide distributions, articles within the winter guide, bilingual rack cards, and even Facebook ads that really target those areas so that we can really make sure that we were not only just placing out actual more brochures to the exact same communities, to the exact same partners. They worked very hard to make sure that we're reaching out and we're connecting to those individuals that have no clue that we are here, and that we're not just recycling the exact same partners over and over again, that we're working year after year, month after month to introduce new information and the forest reserve to those individuals and those communities and organizations within economically diverse, disconnected areas. And that will be all for the group. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you all so much. Really great presentations from our panelists here. So I'm going to start asking some questions that we have, as well as questions that we're getting from the chat. Please, if you have questions, continue to pop those into the chat or question boxes. So we, first of all, are getting a lot of questions about access to the forest reserves and park spaces. So for all of the panelists, why is access to the parks so important? And we had a couple specific questions about how people are able to access the forest reserves without cars, and what can be done to kind of help folks make those connections. And then on the data side, what distance was actually used to calculate sufficient access to the parks?
I can take the data question. So
Okay.
CMAP used GIS analysis to come up with our targets. And we basically analyzed land use data to see if we converted strategic vacant lots into parks, you know, how much more access could we provide to people. So there were different buffers that were used to calculate access to neighborhood parks as well as larger parks. So I think the buffers were half a mile for neighborhood parks and a mile for larger areas. But I would also mention that if anyone's interested in taking a deeper dive into the methodology, the link I provided to the Access to Parks onto 2050 layer has all that detailed methodology there. So anyone who's interested can take a look at that.
And I'll respond to I believe one of the questions was access and how do we just increase that piece. So what's interesting is that when we were actually working on a position paper, we were this was a huge issue for us because we wanted to actually work to bring open space to those EDA areas. But we realized, at least for the forest preserve, we're so different than an actual park. It's really important for us to make sure that we not just buy land, but it needs to actually be economically valuable for us. So therefore, we transitioned a little and tried to work on ways to bring people to the forest. So what that consisted of, again, as I mentioned, the grant program, which we dive more into, that means partnering with schools, partnering with community groups, partnering with organizations. And as part of that partnership, we're providing bus services for those that don't have cars, because we are the force reserve. So there's a lot of times there's lack of access via public transportation. So therefore, that is part of the process in those grants, in those partnerships.
Yeah, and I would just double click on, I mean, I think we posted the position paper, and there's a lot of details that we kind of skipped over just to try to get to the READY case study. But somebody was asking, well, you know, how did you determine, like, you know, what are the different parameters? So you can take a look at that position paper, but, you know, the straightforward answer that, you know, why is this so important? I mean, in 2020, the Forest Preserves of Cook County did make a very concerted effort to keep their spaces open during sort of like the phase 2, like the height of the lockdown, and their numbers have been pretty like high up there. I mean, I think they're breaking some records in some of the locations. So clearly, in general, the public recognize and respond to the importance of just being in connection with nature, having a quiet space to go to, feeling that they can get away for a little while and enjoy the outdoors. Of course, the racial equity question is how many of those are from the EDAs? You know, are there still transportation barriers? And, you know, I keep on saying this to people that I talk with, you know, a lot of our agencies, a lot of the organizations that you work for are pretty old, right? I mean, the forest preserves are over 100 years old. This is a beginning. We cannot expect to dismantle decades of institutionalized racism in 6 months. So we're working on it, and we're starting to collect that data, and it's really important to connect that up with meeting the mission of the organization.
Yeah, Kathy, we had a question that directly relates to your comment that you're just making about how are we getting meaningful feedback from community members about increasing green spaces?
Right. So I think that's a really important channel that needs to be built. But similar to building a channel, we got to make sure that the aqueduct or where the channel is going into to deliver that information is also strong. So whereas, yes, it's very important that community input and all of that stuff is facilitated. And, you know, the way to think about it is there is this sort of general process that racial equity impact assessments use, where they actually bring in community input right at the beginning of a policy process. That's great. The challenge that we're trying to work on at the same time is that internally, for a lot of organizations that do have planning departments or planners or go through this process, is that the industry default is not to do that. Okay, it's to look at data and to hire really smart people who have really great degrees, and for them to identify what the policy options are based upon a whole bunch of technical expertise. So we're actually working on the internal environment to do some culture change and to make sure that processes like that, when you go running out and you collect all this information from the community, you're not just like, you know, doing that Raiders of the Lost Ark, you stick it in a box and you throw it in some warehouse. It's like it actually connects up to impacts. So it's a process. I'm saying what I was saying earlier is like it's not going to happen in 6 months. We're hoping that in 3 years, by next year, that we have a really strong strategic plan that incorporates racial equity work not just into one position that's going to save the whole organization, but across multiple positions, such as in planning or such as in, you know, HR or maybe the police or wherever we're going to go through that process. So sometimes it does work to hire one position and to have that position sort of represent racial equity. We're going to go through the process of actually spending a year really analyzing what the organization really needs and wants before, you know, and then design something that will be sustainable.
I have one more question about access, and then after that, we'll transition to a lot of questions about implementation of these recommendations. So a question for Tracy and Kathleen asking about whether personal safety and that experience that people have in the forest preserves is part of your calculation of access.
I think that as of right now, again, as Kathleen mentioned, we're still building up the planning, and we're still building up the process to even gather that information so that we can really be intentional about how we make those decisions. But as far as security and access, I think that a lot of nowadays, we've made a lot of changes. We've made a lot of recommendations prior to 2017, 2018 that have been in place that many customers, many residents, many patrons have felt that they feel safer now in a forest preserve than they did before. However, again, there's still the piece of the individual, the implicit bias piece. That is what we're working on. That is what we're working on even now with our police officers, because a lot of times as of right now, we are noticing that safety is not necessarily safety as in years prior where there's animals, dogs, and things like that. Now safety is this person that works for the forest preserve is either making me feel safe or unsafe. And that's what we're working on, because that is the individual implicit bias piece. That is the piece that requires so much training on top of the actual organization changes, the institutional changes that we have to make on top of that.
Mm-hmm. And, I was actually looking up, I saw a question flash by, someone's asking about data in terms of the workforce of the forest preserve. So I'm just pulling this from the report that was published in 2019, so it's a little dated. So as of then, there were 627 full-time employees of the Cook County Forest Preserves, of which 8% are Asian, 24%, 1% is, I'm reading the wrong column, 1% is Asian American, Black or African American, 31%, Hispanic or Latino, 11, white is 57. Somebody asked, we look at a lot of data all the time, so you just got to give us a minute. But that's to answer that. And then there was another question, well, are you going to do the training for the police department? Of course, we will do the training for the police department. I mean, as you all know right now, given the environment and the kind of toxic debates that are going, there's a lot of pressure on police departments to do a lot of different things. And so we are offering the training, but there's also other trainings they're going through, other processes they're going through. And this is just one piece of that puzzle that we're trying to offer. We did have ready committee members who were from that department. And, one of our strongest ones was last year. But because of COVID, because of these things that are happening in 2020, it's been really challenging. And again, I keep on pointing this out, like, we've been doing this for a year and a half now. And so I think that it's about testing and really learning more than trying to roll out this humongous thing and making all these claims. Like, we knew that the police department and HR and other departments are really important to incorporate into this work. And we've learned some lessons in terms of how we have to work with those departments to make sure that we build stronger ties and inclusivity. So yes, absolutely, we are working and offering this to the police department.
Great, that's a great transition. One of the questions about implementation was about how you're getting the leadership on board and how the board was engaged in the process. So you started answering that, but if there's more that you want to add.
I would just say, I think we are extremely sorry. The sun is giving me this amazing heavenly glow right now. But I would say, I think that is so essential, and it was so important for us to really have the support of our top leaders. Our superintendent and deputy superintendent were extremely open, and they were from the very beginning so supportive of everything that we wanted to do. And there was no, we don't want to do that. No, we can't do that. It was, let's make it happen. So having that support, and this was, to be honest with you, this was something that was different that I've seen in any organization where you have those that are somewhat, non-management, because there's no directors, there's no deputy directors on this committee. So you have hourly employees reporting directly to the superintendent and deputy superintendent to make changes and recommendations for the entire district. So having that dynamic, having that setup was extremely essential for the success of the committee.
You should, Tracy, do you want to tell your experience with presenting the Ready 101 workshop with the senior management?
Absolutely. So we actually, as mentioned earlier, we are starting our Racial Equity 101 trainings, and our very first group that we trained was our senior staff, which was our directors and deputy directors. And again, our superintendent and deputy participated. And the very first ask after that training was, can we make this mandatory? And honestly, before I can say I even really got the question out, our HR director jumped right on it. Yes, absolutely, let's make it happen. So it's that type of support that really pushes this committee on. And there was no negative feedback of, we know we don't have time for training or how long is nothing. Every single one was ready to schedule training for their team, ready to make it mandatory. There were no complaints of anything being mandatory, and they were really excited to get started.
That's awesome. Any insights from that process about, or advice for folks that might be having a more difficult time bringing their leadership along with them?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot because, it's the forest preserve work has been extremely rewarding, and it's great. And there's some work in Evanston that I've been involved with. And, being an academic, part of what I'm thinking about a lot is, how is this actually supporting some type of social science theory, like some replicable work? Is this just a just so story because we have some awesome leaders in the forest preserve and this cannot be replicated? So I think it's fair to still keep that open as a question. Okay, so I'm not saying that we fixed it all and that this is going to work everywhere all the time. I do think, though, that the one thing that you cannot not have in an organization are leaders who believe in facts, fact-based evidence, data-driven, but also you need leaders who really still connect to the vision of public service, right? That we are government, and government needs to get better. And this path forward will actually help each and every one of our departments and agencies have more meaningful impact, because right now the narrative is defund them all. They're not doing it. Look at how useless, we've been beaten down by that narrative for not just this past year, but for decades. So you really need to be able to connect with leaders of organizations that truly live that spirit of public service in a way that you can't train it in them, or you can't it's just something that should be there. So two things, right? So data driven, we need people who really because you can't avoid it. In the internal process, there is a lot of information, including number data, but also qualitative feedback that we analyze. So if we don't have that support or that same belief that this is real information that we should be receiving and analyzing, that's going to be tough. But I think that second piece, which is just you need leaders who really genuinely want to see your agency do better and acknowledge that it could do better, not that you're holding it together and it's okay and we're just getting enough done. It's no, we absolutely have to do better.
Great. We have some more specific questions about implementation of the recommendations and how you're measuring some of the progress that you're making. So we have one question about, can we expect to see more focus on capital projects in disinvested areas, especially forest preserves that have had little recent investment?
Ultimately, that is a goal. And again, as we talk about the projects, the pilot projects, one of the groups last year, again, as I mentioned, worked on the procurement process. But of course, I think there's always space for the building an equitable budget in general. And part of that equitable budget is making sure that at least planning and development, which is probably the department that has the largest budget, is making sure that we're spending it in an equitable way. But I think that's also part of the Racial Equity 101 training, in which, for example, there was we did a training for our senior staff right before COVID in January, where they were able to learn a little bit about racial impact assessments. Learning about that, just even though it was one class and it was one training session, it really opens up the mind to understand how do you incorporate this in your day-to-day work, which is also the purpose of the Racial Equity 101 trainings. How do we incorporate this? How does everyone incorporate this in their everyday work? How does everyone make themselves responsible? So now, is there an actual detailed plan as of right now? And as far as the process goes, no, but it is coming. But right now, we wanted to make sure that we build a foundation.
I mean, I think Tracy's absolutely right. And the only, maybe from the perspective of somebody who teaches public administration and public policy classes, you know, I've been doing an assessment right now across not just our program, but all PA programs that are in our area. And very few, I mean, right now it's 0. So, and next semester I'm actually teaching a class that's on leadership and management with racial equity, and it's one of the first classes that has that in the title. So to Tracy's point, it's like that one training that she was able to do with Amanda really just opens up the set of models that most professionals have never been exposed to. So aside from racial equity impact analyses, you know, there's this thing called participatory budgeting. And, you know, I cannot find a class that actually trains our urban planners, our policy folks, our MPAs on this model. And it's not that they have to go run out and do it right away, but it's like you've got to have it somewhere in your toolkit that these deliberative democracy models that really are effective exist before, you know, you start throwing a bunch of other stuff on top of it. So it really is like, it's a twin, like we got to get the training out there now because we need the change and we need the impact now. But also, how do we make sure we build this into, you know, our curriculum, our pedagogy, so that, you know, 5-10 years from now, we're not scraping all over the place for the 3 people who know something about racial equity and public administration. That, you know, I would like to like slow down and not have so much work to do. So it would be really great to have that that cohort, like really large cohort, doing this work at every single level.
Great. And then one more specific question about implementation. Does the Forest Reserves have a procurement program or goals for minority participation?
Outside of the general WEBE-MEBE process that we already have, there has actually been changes. To be honest with you, there have been some positive changes to process due to COVID, such as I mentioned earlier, there were these large packets that people were expected to bring 3 to 4 copies over, and had to be time stamped by a certain time, and it can be a hassle. It was a little complicated. So now they've made changes to make things a little bit more electronic. So right now there's still a process because, as Kathleen mentioned, it wasn't until our presentation from last year where part of that pilot project was getting understanding, and that's when you really realize just because people are not, the process isn't easy now doesn't necessarily mean people don't want to make it easier. And really focus on those EDAs and focus on those communities or individuals, because these are the same processes that concessions, regular individual small business owners concessions actually participate in. So how do we work to make sure that we're bringing more of those in? So they are very intentional now. There's already a process to make sure that each and every one they're reviewed. They're, again, looked at whether they're minority or women-owned businesses. So that is something that was already built into it. So now we're just expanding on that a little bit more.
Great. From the 3 of you, any more thoughts about how the Forest Preserves or an organization who wants to do this can measure success on these recommendations that you are planning to move forward. Okay, if not, that's fine. We covered everything. And then
Big question, Chloe. That's a tough one. I mean, you know, I get asked a lot, you know, just because of COVID, you know, I've been trying to participate and sort of share what has been going on. I'll be honest with you, things I'm really feeling the pressure around is that, you know, as these implementation projects, you know, keep on popping up all over the place. I mean, really, after the George Floyd murder, it's like everyone had an RFP out, okay, to do something with racial equity, and like more than half of them that I just would read through would just make my heart sink into my feet, like just because there's a lot of confusion out there about what people think they need or want. And it's almost like, you know, they're just trying to throw spaghetti on the wall and just be like, okay, like something's sticking, and it's a little bit, it's challenging. I think that when it comes to implementation, when it comes to racial equity, the best thing to do, I mean, you know, everyone knows that the Government Alliance on Racial Equity is out there. You know, depending on your size and your budget and what you need, it could be a great fit, it could not. I just need to carve out some time to like write up just what I keep on thinking of is just, here are some things for you. Like if you are in the same spot that maybe the Forest Preserves or, you know, Evanston find themselves in or found themselves in, here are some really important things to like check off or look for if you are looking for consultants, what to write into an RFP, what to actually currently assess yourself, your organization, where your leadership is at before you go running forth and trying to like, you know, like throw something at it. So, I mean, I'm currently teaching 2 classes and doing this work. So I would say that if I had a good model, I mean, you know, eventually I will release it. I'll share it out broadly and share it with you guys. And hopefully we can get something going like towards the end of this year.
Thank you so much. I know it's a tough question. And that was my question. That was someone in the chat. So they're asking us some tough ones. So maybe in our last few minutes here, some reflection from all 3 of our panelists about how the importance of access to parks and green spaces has changed or been highlighted during COVID-19.
Well, I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because of COVID and schools closing and things like that, our organization really struggled with having staff as well as resources. But we worked extremely hard, everyone did, to make sure that we remained open, even if it wasn't every single site, but we made sure that especially in some of those areas where there is very few green space or forest preserves, for example, Dan Ryan, we worked very hard to make sure that we left Dan Ryan open as being one of the only forest preserves in the city of Chicago on the south side, so that people can have consistent access, utilize the trails, utilize the bike there. And I think we couldn't have done a better job, honestly. The team worked amazingly.
Yeah, going off what Tracy said, I think you know, COVID really exposed the need for parks and open space and having space for people to get together safely. You know, when I go to my neighborhood parks here, I see people just having picnics and hanging out, and that's really the only way right now that you can, you know, get together with someone and build community in your neighborhood. So I think it really exposed the need for more parks.
You know, speaking of building community, I think that one of the things that has been really just, you know, personally uplifting and gratifying is that, you know, as we had to shut down, you know, in-person operations, we have had our monthly Ready committee meetings every single month. And we look forward to them. And especially during, the aftermath of, I mean, everything that's been going on with just the racial, tension that's happening, just being able to have that space and for us to express how we're doing and then feel reassured that we're going to roll up our sleeves and actually dig into some data and to make the forest preserves more inclusive and more welcoming and to address those issues has been, it's a little bit like, for me, I don't know, it's like soul reassuring that, you can connect up all of this anxiety and fear and all this stuff to actual things that will make the forest preserves, to keep Dan Ryan open or to see people picnicking and they're diverse and having a good time and feeling included. Like that's kind of what motivates the whole spirit of the Ready Committee.
Fantastic. Well, thank you three ladies, Katie, Tracy, and Kathleen, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you again to CMAP and the Forest Preserves for hosting this webinar, and that will wrap up our time together. Please be sure to look back in the chat box for resources, data, and documents that our panelists referenced. There should be links there. And the webinar has been recorded, and you should be able to find it soon on CMAP's YouTube channel. Also, look out for and please respond to a survey about the webinar to help us know what you liked about it and how we can improve future webinars. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.